Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is 11 a.m. Eastern Time, July 9th, 2025. My name is Sebastian Parra, and I'm here with my co-host, Josiah McGee. Last week, we brought you an episode discussing the groundbreaking peace deal between Israel and Syria, which is still in the works. We're still tracking that. And those negotiations are only one aspect of many other negotiations that are happening right now. This week, we want to discuss the negotiations for a ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip, which is what we have all been anticipating for a long time. What would this ceasefire actually look like? Why are there various sides interested now? Why does it seem like the time is right now? And what are some arguments for it and against it? So let's get started. As always, we have Josiah, who has spent a lot of time digging into this so we can bring you the latest. So Josiah, thank you for bringing this topic today. Let's talk. We're going to talk first about the proposal, what's being negotiated, and what are the consequences of this. So let's talk about the framework. What is in the current framework for this proposal?
Yeah, great question. So the current framework is something that's been brought forward by an envoy of President Trump by the name of Steve Witkoff. And basically, he put together this proposal for a new ceasefire in Gaza, something that he's been actually trying to put on the agenda for quite a while now. Basically, what it breaks down to is it's a 60-day ceasefire. Hamas, in exchange for this 60-day ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, would give back 10 of the 20 remaining hostages in the Gaza Strip who are still alive. There are quite a few more who are deceased. They would also be giving back 18 bodies of hostages that they still hold in the Gaza Strip. And this wouldn't happen all at once. It probably would be 8 live hostages to start, and then 2 later on during the deal, and then the bodies released over various stages throughout the deal, something like that. It's not clear the exact timing yet, still being negotiated, but it wouldn't happen all at once is the main takeaway. There also would be, of course, some key Israeli withdrawals from different areas in the Gaza Strip that they are currently holding. There would be an increase of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, and probably some changes in terms of the way that it's distributed. There would be some commitment to negotiations for a permanent ceasefire or end to the war, not necessarily a commitment that the war actually ends in 60 days, but that they would begin the process of negotiating a permanent end to the war. And unlike some previous proposals, this also would include a U.S. guarantee of the conditions of the ceasefire, that the U.S. would hold accountable both Israel and Hamas to observe and respect the conditions set by the ceasefire in order to make sure that it holds. So it's an interesting proposal. It is, got its fair share of proponents and critics, and I think a lot of really interesting things to unpack as far as the nuances that are still being worked out and negotiated.
Yeah, and let us remind people, I think there are still 58 people left in Gaza, of which about 20 are alive, right?
Right.
So we're talking about half of the living hostages. Josiah, before we keep going, from an outsider's perspective, to me, this seems like a really high price to pay for 10, not high price to pay for hostages. I think Hamas is getting a lot here, and Israel's not getting enough. Hamas is going to get 60 days to recover, to regroup, all of that, while Israel only gets half of its living hostages. Before we move into what is left to negotiate, because the Times of Israel has reported that the deal is almost 80 to 90% done. There are just a few details left. We're going to tell you what is the final things that are being negotiated. Our opinion as non-Israelis matters less, but it seems like Israel's paying a high price for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we can unpack a little bit what's still being negotiated, because there are some interesting things there that explain what is the price or what is still being negotiated in terms of the price. And I'm sure during the course of the conversation, we'll get into some of our reactions to, is this a good idea or not? But I think we have to understand first, like, what's still being negotiated in terms of the price.
All right, and then let's do that first then.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course,
what is left to being negotiated? What is the last 10 to 15% that allegedly is still being negotiated?
Well, it's an interesting percent number that's being thrown around. I'm curious where they're getting that number, because there's actually several things.
They said yesterday that it's 80 to 90% done.
Yeah, who are they quoting though? Because
I mean, Israeli top official.
Sure, but yeah. Okay. Well, we'll give the benefit of the doubt that number is somewhere close to accurate. Assuming it is, that's impressive. But if you look at the list of things that are still being reported as undecided or still need to be hammered out, it's not an insignificant list. And it's actually several things that in previous rounds of negotiations or lead up to ceasefires have led to the collapse of negotiations or to ceasefires not happening or almost collapsing because these issues are important. So give you a few examples. There are several issues related to how many Palestinian prisoners would actually be released. Okay, that's a big deal. That's a major deal for Israel. Yes, there are military costs or strategic and tactical costs to withdrawing from certain areas in the Gaza Strip. But a major part of the cost to Israeli society is the release of Palestinian prisoners, most of which in previous releases have been accused of or convicted of some pretty serious crimes, including murder, terrorism, things like that. So that's not a small thing that is left on the table and hasn't been fully hammered out yet. You also have questions about which hostages would be released. It's a big deal because the latest reports coming out are that the intelligence and security establishment in Israel had given the political establishment or the government, the prime minister's office, a list of hostages and their medical conditions. Unlike previous rounds of negotiations for ceasefires, where they sort of rank ordered each of the hostages in terms of priority based on their medical status or their risk of serious medical issues, things like that. They declined to do so in this case. They basically handed the government a portfolio and said every single one of the hostages is a humanitarian case with serious medical issues. You have to decide how to prioritize them because they're all in such poor condition. We can't decide for you how to prioritize these hostages. That's really, really very serious. That's I think something that really needs to be hammered out and is not something I'm confident can be done very quickly. So again, I would maybe push back on the idea that we're almost there. Yes and no. I do think there's a couple of things that are still pretty significant and have to be hammered out. And in the past, again, have been very consistent sticking points or issues when it comes to finalizing negotiations. It's how many prisoners, names of prisoners, and it's names of hostages in order in which the hostages would be released. Now, a couple other things that are being reported as pretty significant issues that have to be addressed as well. Amit Segal recently did some reporting on this. He's following very closely. And he shared, I'll throw up a map here so you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about, but he shared there's a couple of things that are, pretty significant issues that still need to be discussed in terms of where the Israeli withdrawals, for example, are going to take place. So if you look at this map, you can see areas that Israel controls in the Gaza Strip. Prior to the start of this latest operation, Gideon's Chariots, which began after the last ceasefire ended, Israel was controlling a large perimeter buffer zone around the border of the Gaza Strip, basically defending those communities on the Israeli side of the border from Hamas. It had not extended nearly as far as it has now into some of these areas in the Gaza Strip, places like Rafah, Khan Yunis, advancing in the northern Gaza Strip on Gaza City, some of the central refugee camps in the northern Gaza Strip, where there are supposedly about 1 million Palestinians living right now. And these areas have even to this point not been entered by the IDF. Hamas is still hiding there and has been ever since October 7. But the point remains that Israel has gained a lot of territory during the latest operation and is now controlling, by their estimation, somewhere upwards of 65% of the Gaza Strip. What still needs to be figured out is what exactly does a withdrawal mean? Does a withdrawal mean that Israel backs up a little bit to humanitarian zones that it has created? Does it mean that Israel completely abandons all of the territory that it has taken during this latest operation since March, essentially? Yeah, there's a pretty wide spectrum in terms of how much territory Hamas could demand that Israel give up in exchange for a ceasefire, where it would necessarily need to withdraw to. So there's a lot that still needs to be unpacked there. I think the humanitarian aid mechanisms is also a very big deal. Right now, there's an understanding that humanitarian aid would have to increase during a ceasefire. What Hamas is demanding in addition to that is that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation would basically cease operations. And the reason why is that Israel's been taking this area in southern Gaza, around Rafah, especially Khan Yunis. It's been developing these aid distribution centers in areas that it controls, and there are no Hamas fighters, to their knowledge, in an effort to separate the Palestinian population from Hamas, so that Hamas can't control the humanitarian aid, and therefore it can't control the population, and its political control of the Gaza Strip is weakened. Hamas wants that control back, so they're demanding not just an increase of humanitarian aid, but also the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation stop operations and that control of that humanitarian aid revert back to other organizations that Hamas can control. So there's a lot of things here that are really very, very serious and have to be dealt with. The last thing I'll mention is that Hamas is going to be very committed to the idea that the war ends. The ceasefire needs to not just give them some promise that there will be negotiations for an end to the war. It needs to give them a promise that the war is actually going to end, because that's been their demand for the past several rounds of negotiations for ceasefires. It's been their expectation. And Israel, of course, is opposed to this, but that's a pretty big gap. This still needs to be closed. So even if these issues make up, only 80 to, even if I should say 80 to 90% of the negotiations are finished, there's only 15 to 20% of issues left. I think those 15 to 20% of issues left are very serious and are still significant gaps that are not going to be closed immediately.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the last 10, 20% are really big factors. Maybe they have the oven warmed up, they have the mold, they have the frosting for the cupcakes. They just need to get the milk and eggs. So pretty big deal. This is a terrible analogy. They're like almost there. Anyways, so I just want to remind our audience that this issue of prisoner exchange is a really painful issue for Israelis, because let us remember the guy who started this war, Yahya Sinwar, was given back to Gaza in a prisoner exchange. And not only him, but a lot of the other commanders, a lot of the people who participated in, who really commanded this terrorist, the biggest slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust, they were prisoners who were given back in exchange for other soldiers that were kidnapped in the past, or one soldier actually. So this, you just never know. Israel, we're about to go into this. What is the status of Hamas right now? They're about to get a bunch of other heroes, a bunch of other people who've been in jail, who've been preparing. And when they get back to Gaza, guess what they're going to do? So let's go into that, because it seems like there has been very little progress until now. And then suddenly, Netanyahu goes to Washington and it seems like they're very close to a deal. Why is that? Why does it seem like this negotiations have been very much stuck until now?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, there's this really intransigent sentiment among the Hamas leaders that they have to stay, they have to survive. So their policy has been Hamas has to maintain its ability to survive as an organization, that its leadership must survive, and Israel's stance throughout much of the war, at least rhetorically speaking, has been that Hamas must be destroyed. These are two categorically opposed sets of priorities. They're inherent contradictions. You can't have both at the same time. Neither side is going to be able to get their way, and allow the other side to also have what they want if they maintain these positions. So those very strong oppositions between the two have been hard to overcome in the past when it comes to these negotiations. You also, I think, have to understand that they have been working towards negotiations, but trying to improve their leverage. So both have been trying to operate in such ways that they might improve their ability to gain some advantage during the negotiations. For Hamas, in many cases, this means trying to make Israel look worse. So trying to gain as much international support as it can, trying to wait out the game as long as possible and see if it can increase the level of fatigue both in Israel and in the international community for the war. Because if they can just outlast everyone else and everyone else gets tired of this fighting, then maybe they can survive the war. It's a key part of Hamas's strategy. On Israel's side of things, they've been doing their best to try to weaken Hamas politically through these different humanitarian mechanisms that we just referenced. They've also been doing their best to improve the situation regionally and do things like weakening Hamas's patron in Iran, or building coalitions with other countries around the Middle East, trying to shore up support for some sort of day after plan in Gaza, which is still, tragically and very unfortunately underdeveloped. There's no good plan for the day after in Gaza, which maybe we get to later. But these are the kinds of things that Israel's been trying to work towards. Is if we can just find enough ways to get the U.S. administration to back us on certain positions in the negotiations, or to find different sponsors in the Middle East for some of the solutions we're trying to come up with, or to weaken Hamas's support in the Middle East, then maybe we can come to the negotiating table with a better position. And you can see both sides have been actively trying to work behind the scenes to improve their position before actually taking these negotiations seriously. It looks like right now they're getting to a point where they are doing that, in large part, I would say, because President Trump has put the issue on the agenda and is saying, I want a deal. We need to figure out a way to make this happen. But this would be, I would say, the first time in the last couple of months, honestly, since the last ceasefire, that you can make the argument that the negotiations are being taken a little bit more seriously. It's not clear that they're going to result in a ceasefire in the short term, but they are at least being taken a bit more seriously.
Yeah, I think President Trump deserves all the benefit of the doubt that we can give him right now. But I am concerned sometimes that he might prefer a deal for the sake of a deal, just to get it done with, instead of thinking about what's the best deal. But Josiah, when we talked about Lebanon and Hezbollah over there, a lot of smart people have analyzed during the Iran war that they had weapons, they have missiles, they had rockets, but Israel had taken away their will to fight. So Hezbollah could have get involved, but they were like, no, we're not going to get involved. It seems like Israel has taken away their will to go back and fight. Hamas, has Israel been able to take away their will to fight? Do they not have enough appetite anymore? And or if it's not, why are they interested in negotiating now?
Well, it's not that Hamas has lost the appetite to fight. That's definitely not the case. And
these guys are stubborn.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate, I think, and not understood well enough how the Hamas leadership thinks about progress during the course of the war. So there's a guy, a Hamas official, who lives abroad. He doesn't actually live in the Gaza Strip, but he's part of the team that is representing Hamas internationally as part of these negotiations indirectly with Israel, and speaking to the Egyptians or the Qatari governments about these negotiations. And his name is Ghazi Hamad. He's given some interviews in which he said some pretty crazy things, like, we'll keep fighting as long as we have to. The advantage that Palestinians have over the Israelis is that we don't get tired of fighting, that the Israelis can kill 100,000, 200,000 more Palestinians, and it won't matter. We will continue to fight, and that is our advantage. That's a pretty twisted calculus, I think, and really needs to be better understood. I think that Hamas is willing to sacrifice as many Palestinians as is necessary in order to preserve itself as an organization, as a movement, and as a candidate for leadership of the Palestinian nationalism, and that it's willing to pay however many Palestinian lives necessary in order to serve its own interests. That's really very tragic, very evil, I think, but not very well understood. Now, when it comes to why is Hamas potentially interested in the ceasefire now, whereas they haven't been as much previously, remember I said they've been primarily interested in survival. That's the reason why they hadn't been so interested in these ceasefire deals up until this point. It's because there hadn't been any guarantees that Hamas and its leadership would survive a ceasefire or an end to the war, and that's what they've been seeking. Now I think you're seeing more pressure on them because it's become clear that there's a lot more political pressure on them in the Gaza Strip. For example, there are anonymous Hamas sources claiming to outlets like the BBC that Hamas is about to collapse in the Gaza Strip, that Israel actually controls more like 80% of the Gaza Strip. Right. I think 80% is too high. I think what they're accounting for is territory that neither Israel or Hamas really controls right now. It's kind of no man's land. What Israel effectively controls, according to Israeli sources, is more like 65, maybe 70% of the Gaza Strip. But still, Hamas is saying they've lost the ability to, or no longer effectively control themselves any more than 20% of the Gaza Strip. And because of the lack of humanitarian aid control that they have, because that control is being transferred to groups like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, there are consequences. You lose the ability to stockpile supplies. You lose the ability to sell those supplies and make money. If you don't have money, you lose the ability to pay salaries of your officials and your fighters and anyone else that's on your payroll. And it begins to break down fairly quickly at that point. If your economic control of the population in the Gaza Strip is non-existent or is weakening very quickly, then your political control also weakens very quickly. You're starting to see rivals to Hamas developing, like the Abu Shabaab militia. So there are, I think, any number of reasons for Hamas to feel more and more threatened, not just by Israel, but by the general situation in the Gaza Strip. And they want to get some control back. So I think that's the primary reason right now, is not that they're tired of fighting. They're not. They would fight Israel to the death if they had to. But they are concerned that their downfall might not be Israel, but other factors inside the Gaza Strip that they can't control right now, and they need a ceasefire in order to get control back over some of those other variables.
Yeah. So I just want to insert here. This is a prayer point. Christian friends, you who are listening, um, these people of the leaders of Hamas who love terror, who love death, uh, we need to pray that they will repent, that the Lord will convict their hearts. God can change the heart of these people. God has changed the heart of many people in the Bible, and we need to pray for these people that they will give up on this insistence of death. This guy that you mentioned, Ghazi Hamad, I remember like maybe October 10th, like just a few days after October 7th, he went on TV and he was touting how we will do this 100 times over. We'll do this 1,000 times as necessary. We want to kill more. Like they, of course, it's very comfortable for him to say that in a hotel in Doha, because he's not the one doing the fighting. But even others like Ismail Khania, who lost his son, I think his members of his family were lost in fighting, and he's like, "We'll give more." Yahya Sinwar lost his entire family as well. But these people just love death. This is a spiritual thing going on that in this community, they're just brainwashed. They just love death. They glorify death, and we need to pray that the Lord will break this stronghold in their mentality, because they are the leaders of a people who are suffering under their evil leadership. But so Josiah, thank you for that. That's why Hamas is interested now. Now let's talk about Israel. Why is Israel interested now? They are like on top of the world. They defeated Iran, Hezbollah. They are seemingly defeating Hamas in Gaza. They're capturing more territory than ever. So why are they interested now?
The situation on the Israeli side of things is a little bit complicated, I think. And here is where you start to get into some of the debate that's happening in Israel. Israel is a very divided society right now on whether this is a good idea or not. And there's some pretty, hard truths being said to each other inside Israeli society right now that are hard for people to wrestle with at times. One of the things that's being said right now that I think is looking more and more true, unfortunately, but is hard for a lot of people to accept, is that defeating Hamas militarily might not happen. It might not be possible, frankly. So the government has set out this agenda to say, we're not going to accept an end to the war until Hamas is defeated militarily. It's kind of where you started in the weeks after October 7, and over time, it's become a lot more ambiguous. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? What are the specific objectives where you can say we've won, or you can declare victory over Hamas, militarily speaking? And the reality is the complete and total destruction of Hamas in the Gaza Strip is looking more and more unlikely, because if you think about the history of the war in Gaza over the last almost 2 years now, the strategy for the most part has been enter an area, clear it, hold it very briefly, and leave. And then eventually you go back after Hamas re-enters the area and reestablishes itself. You clear it again, you hold it very briefly, and then you leave again. That's not an effective way of actually destroying an organization. It's a good way of killing a lot of terrorists, but it's not a good way of actually controlling the area and completing the complete military destruction of an organization like Hamas. More recently, the strategy has been, okay, let's go and not just clear areas, but hold on to them for a while. Create these humanitarian zones where Palestinian civilians can come, but Hamas can't, in order to separate Hamas and the civilian population, and work towards some sort of end to the war a day after in Gaza plan, where you've seen them experimenting with some different options as far as what the day after might look like. The problem is that they've succeeded in clearing and holding, again, up to 65, 70% of the Gaza Strip. But what they haven't done is enter the real strongholds of Hamas, the central refugee camps, center of Gaza City and the Gaza Strip, places that they haven't been inside since October 7. It's not just that they were there and left and Hamas came back. It's that they have not succeeded in the last year and a half, almost 2 years, at clearing Hamas from some of these locations. So that's a major red flag.
And of course, the risk, I guess, is getting closer, might endanger the hostages' lives.
Right. There are areas that they don't want to go because you will endanger the hostage lives. They're being used as human shields. There are places where There's still very large tunnel networks that are very dangerous for the IDF to operate within. These are places that are, large civilian populations that just don't want to leave, frankly. And it's unclear that the IDF is actually prepared to enter these places after almost 2 years of not doing so. Are they actually at a spot where they are prepared? They have the plans and the resources necessary to actually go in and finish the job? I don't know. On the flip side of that, what you're looking at is that this war is becoming, increasingly costly for the IDF because the casualty rate is going up. Hamas is shifting into sort of this guerrilla warfare style of fighting where they're not fighting battles on a battlefield per se. They're leaving IEDs or homemade explosives. And you're seeing some pretty serious cases where people are burned alive inside an armored vehicle, or 5 Israeli soldiers earlier this week were killed by an IED. And that's serious. These are locations where the IDF still does not have real control. And even if they did, Hamas could hide underground and continue fighting this war indefinitely. The history of war in the Middle East, speaking from an American perspective, we know this to be true. It's complicated. Even if you liberate or conquer an area, or whatever term you want to use, guerrilla warfare can last for decades. And actually thoroughly militarily defeating an organization like Hamas is a very, very difficult task. So
I think Nadav Ayad explained that the reason why they're more vulnerable now is because they're just sitting ducks. They're just having to move into an area and sit there. And that's not what the military is made for. They're sitting there, terrorists can come up, throw something at them, put something on the road. So they're actually in danger. And it seems to me like a lot of more soldiers have been dying at a higher rate per day or per week in the last 2 weeks. It seems to me.
There's been a sharp escalation. Yeah, I think since March, I heard a number earlier this week. I think 38 IDF soldiers have died, and the number per week over the last month has been increasing. Yeah, there is an upward trend in terms of the number of IDF casualties. So that's something that Israel has to think through. It's like, is this working? Is it actually possible to accomplish our objectives, or do we need to restrain ourselves and think about more limited objectives? You also have, I think, real questions that are being asked about, is it possible for us to actually sustain this strategy of destroying Hamas politically if we can't do it militarily speaking? Because there are two options. One, you go into the refugee camps in northern Gaza and you militarily destroy Hamas. You kill a lot of people. The alternative is you don't necessarily militarily destroy Hamas. You don't kill every Hamas terrorist, but you politically destroy Hamas by convincing the population to give up on them. That requires managing humanitarian aid effectively and controlling it, which is another thing that they've been trying to do in southern Gaza. The issue there is that there's also some serious questions about, is it working? Is it sustainable? There are new reports coming out that Hamas is finding ways of inserting civilians or paying civilians to go collect aid, bring it back to them so that they can then resell it, basically circumventing the whole idea of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation being that Hamas isn't involved. You also have increasing cases where the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation staff are being attacked. They are not necessarily safe. You have cases where the IDF is now admitting that it has unfortunately shot at or even killed civilians who are trying to approach these aid distribution sites in order to collect aid. And what's become very clear, speaking of your hero, we always reference him at least once during an episode, Sebastian, because you love him so much, Haviv Retzegur.
Yep.
He did a great episode recently explaining that the IDF is not well prepared to manage these humanitarian aid sites.
They're an army. They're not a humanitarian thing,
They're not. They're not built for crowd control. They're neither equipped for that. They're not trained for that. They don't have the instructions necessary to do that effectively. And it's a serious question mark about, is this actually realistic? Is it working? And can we sustain this over the long run, being responsible for managing humanitarian aid and preventing Hamas from accessing it without being put in direct confrontation with Palestinian civilians, which is not a place that the IDF wants to be? Big questions. The last thing, because I know we're trying to be respectful of time. The last thing is that hostage conditions are very, very bad. So, I mentioned this earlier. There's some real concerns about this. Things like a report coming out this week about the sexual abuse endured by many of the hostages. We mentioned, of course, already a report about the medical condition of the hostages. And it's a litany of issues that they're facing, everything from muscle loss to starvation to pre-existing conditions like asthma, blindness in some cases, lack of medication that they need. injuries they suffered on October 7, severe mental health issues. I mean, every single one of these cases is considered critical in a humanitarian case that needs to get out, or there is severe risk to their well-being. That's going to put more pressure on Israeli society and in turn on the Israeli government to do something about this, because Israelis think the hostages are important. Throughout most of the war, the majority of Israelis have deemed the hostages to be the top priority. And the more you learn about how dire the conditions are and how much risk these hostages are facing in Gaza, the more pressure there's going to be on Israel to take these negotiations more seriously and consider what compromises they might be willing to make.
Yeah, they're nearing 650 days soon. It's like 641, 42 right now. So hostages have been there for a very, very long time. And it's taking a toll on them. I think I just want to highlight the obvious here for our audience as well, that the reason why Israelis should and care so much about getting their hostages back, like in my country, like I happen to be from Colombia, there are a lot of people kidnapped, and people have been kidnapped for decades. That's unfortunate. I think American people have been kidnapped abroad too by foreign governments and stuff. But in Israel, especially in this case, there's a sacred covenant between the people and the army, that people volunteer their lives. All Israelis had to serve, all the men had to serve 3 years, all the women had to serve 2 years, and then you had to serve in the reserves until you're 36, I think. Many serve even more, pilots serve even longer. So the deal is, I'm willing to do this for my country, I'm willing to sacrifice my life and my children's life, but you'll get me back if I'm ever taken captive. So what are their opinions towards this war right now? I guess I started talking about this at the beginning, about this deal doesn't seem like a great deal. What good deal can you make with a terrorist group? So what is Israeli support for the war like right now?
So yeah, and this is where it gets complicated, because there are very real concerns on one side of the Israeli political spectrum. You have concerns about what happens if we make a ceasefire. What happens if Hamas survives, and not just survives, but is reinforced by whatever number of terrorists we release in exchange for the hostages. And they get what they want in terms of control of humanitarian aid back and all of this. 5-10 years from now, are we going to be facing another October 7? That's a very real concern that some Israelis are feeling right now, is that they have real fears about what the future would look like in the event that a ceasefire is reached. On the flip side of that, if you ask the question what the majority of Israelis believe at this point, it's pretty clear, if you're reading most, if not all, of the polls in Israel, that a majority of the country, despite some of these fears and concerns about the future, still want to prioritize the hostages. They still think that the hostages are more important, and that even if it requires an end to the war, for now, not to say that Israel wouldn't potentially go to war with the Hamas again in the future, more than likely it would, but for now, okay, the war should end, the hostages are more important. That is the opinion of the majority of Israelis, and it has a lot to do with the break of trust, I think, that you referenced on October 7 between the Israeli government and the Israeli people. The need to restore some of that, the sense that it is not just a moral, ethical issue of leadership, but even a national security issue, that if people don't trust the government, they won't fight for the government when they face an existential threat. They won't show up for reserve duty or things like that. And that's a security issue, not just a moral issue. So there's a lot of people who think that the hostages, for a variety of reasons, need to be the top priority right now. You are also, I think, seeing some really interesting things develop as it relates to just the reaction to the IDF casualties, people feeling like, is it worth it? What are these soldiers actually dying for? Are we seeing results, or are we just spinning our wheels? And are we actually going to be given all of the the wins, the victories that the government has promised us in exchange for these young lives, or are they just dying so that the status quo can remain what it is, which is not a very good status quo? Important questions, but these are the kinds of questions that Israelis are asking their government right now, and part of the reason why there is so much pressure for a ceasefire deal, not just for the sake of the hostages, but also for the sake of the young IDF soldiers, or even the reservists with families who are dying as a result of the fighting in the Gaza Strip. The last thing I'll reference very briefly is that there's been some really interesting trends emerging in Israel, where President Trump is very popular right now because of his support for the war up until this point, especially his support for the war against Iran and the strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. But he's also recognized as being someone who cares very deeply about the hostages. He's hosted many of them at the White House after their release. He's met with their families. He's really prioritized the cause of the hostages ever since he came into office. And people in Israel recognize this, and they think that part of what it means to invest in the U.S.-Israel relationship or a deeper relationship with the Trump administration is to advocate for a cause that he's also advocating for, which is the hostages, essentially. So it's a really interesting development. I think that's something that Israelis are picking up on, that they have a potential ally in the White House, someone who also thinks the hostages are important, and they're trying to use that because obviously the Israeli government's Prime Minister Netanyahu especially thinks that President Trump is very important. They want a very good relationship with him. And so many of the people, average people, if you will, on the streets, the protesters are using that relationship as part of their argument that the hostages should be the top priority and that a ceasefire is the right choice. It's far from a black and white issue. I think there are cases that can be made and are being made both by American leaders and Israelis on both sides of the political spectrum for and against the ceasefire. But at this point, to answer your question, a majority think the hostages need to be the top priority and they would be in favor of a ceasefire.
Yeah, and we know during the war, public gatherings were prohibited for safety issues. And as soon as the war was over, the next weekend, the rally that they did was huge.
The war with Iran, you mean?
Yes. What did I say before?
No. Just wanted to clarify. There's been a few wars fought.
Oh, so right. Yeah.
What you're referencing is the war with Iran, 12-day war where ballistic missiles are falling in Tel Aviv. Yeah, that's why the protests were asked to stop, or public gatherings were restricted for a few days.
Yeah, so the war ended on like a Tuesday, and then the next weekend, huge rally, and even last weekend, 4th of July, I saw like a big table with the American flag, kind of appealing to President Trump, say, make a deal now. So this is our prayer point, friends. We need to, Israel has seen a miraculous reversal of its situation from, let's say, November 2023 to now. It's much more secure, and so much that is even thinking about making peace and normalizing relationship with these former rivals, former enemies. But none of this will be a complete victory, a complete joy if the hostages remain. So I think, friends, we need to keep praying. We need to highlighting the situation. Like Josiah said, President Trump met with some hostages. One of the hostages that he met with, somebody who was at our conference in DC. We had a high school conference in DC, and we had the honor of having Yair Horn, a hostage that's liberated, but his brother's still there. And he's been there for 640 some days. And we're about to do another conference. I'm glad to say that we'll have about 130 plus college students coming to DC with us in a few weeks, and we are hoping to have some family members or hostages there. So we're trying to do our part to highlight and to keep the hostages on top of mind. We pray that you'll partner with us and that you keep praying, keep doing what you can to highlight, to share the stories. So Josiah, thank you for bringing this deal to us. One last thing I wanted to mention, geopolitics wise, when Trump went to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to the UAE, there was a lot of talk about Israel being sidelined. But clearly, we see there's no deadline between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel. He is now the head of state, the foreign head of state who's visited the White House most in only these few months. He's been there 3 times already. So, and he nominated President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. So clearly, there is no rift. We're so grateful that this administration has been such a good friend to the Jewish people and to Israel. So let's hope that this will continue. The president wants to see a deal by the end of the week. So if that's the case, we'll be back here next week to tell you about it. Josiah, any last words as we head out?
Yeah, I think just to close with a couple more thoughts on how we should be praying about the situation. Obviously, we want to be praying for the hostages and for wisdom and effective leadership from those who are trying to negotiate. It would be, I think, a positive if we did see some hostages released. Despite the cost, I think that it's an important issue, and we obviously want to pray for their release from captivity. The last thing I did want to mention is also just the importance of praying for a lot of the Palestinians living in Gaza right now. They also ideally would benefit from a ceasefire, but of course, many of them are sort of trapped because they are they are actually truly innocent, and many of them have actually been fighting against Hamas or working against Hamas during this latest operation, many of which would be in danger, I think, if there was a ceasefire and Hamas was able to regain control. So I think it's important not to forget them and the innocent people that have basically taken Israel's side against Hamas and would be in danger if a ceasefire were to take place. We should be praying for their safety, of course, as well, and that Hamas does not regain all of the power that it once had, because it is an evil organization, as we've discussed. So those are my thoughts as far as how we can be praying both before and even during a ceasefire if one does happen. And hopefully there'll be more to share and report the next couple of weeks.
That's a really good point. Yeah, we need to pray for people there who will be the victims of retaliation. Like in Iran, right after the war with Iran ended, Iran started executing people, persecuting people, blaming people. Like some French citizens were blamed for being Israeli spies when, who knows who they really were. They were in jail. So anyways, we need to pray for the retaliation afterwards as well. I want to say another specific point. I think we need to pray that the leaders of Qatar, who are the ones who have the most leverage and influence over the Hamas leaders, will finally have the political will and the desire to put this to end, like to pressure Hamas to give it up. They're the ones who really have the leverage over Hamas. So let's pray that the leaders of Qatar the Lord will work in their hearts to end this war as well. So Josiah, thank you for another great update. Thank you for the pictures. I hope you guys have been enjoying that. Check us out on YouTube. If you're listening to us on Spotify, leave us a comment. Tell us if you have any questions. We want to thank our producers, as always, Avery and Lindsay. Thank you for making this podcast possible. And we'll see you guys next week. Thank you for listening to us. Catch you later. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.